So this is the chart that we ended up with at the end of class last time, with these two questions that we always want to ask of every study that's being done. Okay, so first question we need to ask, was the sample randomly selected? And if the sample was randomly selected, then it is possible to generalize to the population. And if the answer is no, the sample was not randomly selected, then we're not able to generalize to the population. Something I want to point out here, because it came up a little bit in the written homework, is notice there's no mention of sample size here. So it doesn't say, was the sample randomly selected and did it include at least 10,000 people or anything like that. It just says, was the sample randomly selected? So if we randomly select our sample, then we can generalize to the whole population, and it's not dependent on the sample size. So one of the questions on the written homework talked about a study where they randomly sampled 808 adults in a specific age range that they were looking at to ask them if they still lived at home, I think is what they're asking. And part B of that question said, can we, is this sample representative? Can we generalize to the whole population? And the answer was yes. So because the sample was randomly selected, we can generalize to the whole population. There were several people on their homework that said, no, 808 is not a big enough sample size. 808 is so small compared to everybody in the population. And it does seem like a small number, but because we randomly selected the sample, we would expect that sample to be representative of the population. So that's on that one. The other question we're going to ask is, was the explanatory variable randomly assigned? And this question is essentially saying, hey, did we do an observational study or did we do an experiment? And if we did an experiment, which would mean that the explanatory variable was randomly assigned, then yes, we can make conclusions about causality. And if the explanatory variable was not randomly assigned, then no, we cannot make conclusions about causality. So on your written homework last week, this one came up in, I think it was question number 2, where it was talking about the preschool age kids and like the tantrums and how well they were able to verbalize. And that was an observational study because the researchers did not assign the number of tantrums to the preschoolers, right? They didn't say, okay, you get to have 10 tantrums today and you get to have 3 tantrums, and then let's see how well you're able to verbalize, right? In that kind of situation, obviously it's impossible to randomly assign the explanatory variable. So that one was an observational study, and because it's an observational study, we cannot make conclusions about causality. Okay, so back to our big picture, we have this population. We're gonna take a sample because population huge, it might be like everybody in the United States or all voters or something like that, gigantic. No way we can measure everybody. So we take a sample. Okay, the sample is the subset of the population that we actually measure. So these are the people that we actually have numbers for. The method that we use to select that sample is called our sample design, or we say we're sampling from the population. And then we're going to use that sample to draw conclusions about the population. And that's what we call statistical inference. So statistical inference is using sample data to draw conclusions about a population. So chapter 1, which we talked about last week, was all about like, how do I get this data? So we talked about observational studies and experiments and sampling and experimental designs, and we talked about the data set itself. And in chapter 2, we're going to talk about, okay, I have this data now. Now what do I do with it? Okay, and the first thing that we're going to do with it is we're going to do some exploratory data analysis. And along with exploratory data analysis is going to come descriptive statistics and graphs. Exploratory data analysis, again, we're just trying to get a feel for what kind of information is there in our data set. And step 1 of that exploratory data analysis is going to be graph it. Okay, so the very first thing that we always want to do with our set of data is draw a graph. Because that whole adage of a picture is worth 1,000 words, like that totally applies in statistics. So a graph is going to give us a lot of information about the data set, and basically any numbers that we calculate later on are going to basically numerically summarize what we're already seeing in the graph. So graph, super important. And then step 2 after we graph the data, then we're going to look at numerical summaries. So we're going to calculate, whoops, my mouse jumped. So second step is going to calculate numerical summaries. Okay, now the type of graph and numerical summaries that we're going to use is going to depend on the number and type of variables that we have. So the type of graph / numerical summaries that we use depends on the number and type of variables. Okay, we're talking about type of variables. Remember, we talked about 2 types of variables last week. Anybody remember what the 2 types of variables are? Okay, good. I'm seeing a couple different things. I was actually going for categorical versus quantitative, which somebody put there. But explanatory and response is not a bad answer to my question either, because we did talk about that. That's a different type of 2 different types of variables. But yes, explanatory and response, categorical and quantitative. In the case of determining which graph and numerical summaries that we're going to use, we're talking about, hey, do I have categorical variables or do I have quantitative variables? And throughout chapter 2, we're going to talk about all these different scenarios. So today, we're going to talk all about categorical variables. We're going to talk about the graphs and summaries that we're going to do when we have 1 categorical variable, and also when we have 2 categorical variables that we're looking for a relationship between. So first of all, with 1 categorical variable, there's a couple of terms that we need to define before we jump right into the graphs. And that has to do with how we organize the data for 1 categorical variable. So for 1 categorical variable, the data is organized into what we call a frequency table, or we can also use something called a relative frequency table. The data is organized into a frequency table or a relative frequency table. So a frequency table, if we were going to define that, basically it lists the categories for the categorical variable, and it lists the counts of the cases in each category. So a frequency table lists the categories and the count of cases in each category. Okay, so this data came from a random sample of adults in 2012 that were surveyed regarding the type of cell phone that they owned. So this is kind of interesting, I think. So keeping in mind, this is 2012, so this is 8 years ago. So this is going to show you just how much things have changed since 2012, which I thought was kind of interesting. So they asked people, you know, do you have an Android, an iPhone, a BlackBerry, not a smartphone, or no cell phone at all? And here was the result. So this is a frequency table. So it lists the possible categories for that categorical variable, and it lists the count of people in each category. Okay, so just looking at this frequency table, what stands out to you? Like, what's kind of interesting about this data from 2012? Okay, the number of people with no smartphone, huge, right? More Androids than Apples. I thought that was super interesting because I have an Android now, but I feel like I never run into people with Androids. Like, everybody has an iPhone, and they all kind of look down on me when I pull out my Samsung. Okay, and 293 people that didn't even have a cell phone at all. That's like over 10%, I think, of this group that did not even have any cell phone. That was only 8 years ago. 8 years really isn't that long. So yeah, I think this was pretty interesting. So this is the frequency table. Okay, so now let's talk about, now that we have the data organized, let's talk about some graphs for categorical data for 1 categorical variable. All right, so the first graph that we have for categorical data is called a bar chart. Okay, and on a bar chart, then basically the x-axis is going to have your categories, and the y-axis is going to be frequency. So the x-axis is categories, and the y-axis is frequency. Okay, and the frequency can be either as a count or as a percent. All right, and let's talk about what we're going to look for on this bar chart, and then we're going to look at some examples of bar charts. Okay, so what we're trying to figure out from a bar chart is we want to know, hey, what were the categories? So what are the categories, and how do the frequencies in each of those categories compare to each other? So we're looking for, first of all, what are the different categories? And we're also looking for how do the frequencies in each of the categories relate to each other. Okay, so in other words, like which one had the most, which one had the least, were they similar to each other, were they different to each other? That's the kind of thing that we're looking for. So which category had the most, which had the least. All right, so here's what a bar chart of that cell phone data looks like. So you can see along here on the x-axis, you can see all the different options that there were for that categorical variable: Android, BlackBerry, no cell phone, non-smartphone, iPhone. I think the BlackBerry one's kind of funny. I don't know if anybody pointed that out in the chat window, but I don't know anybody. Do BlackBerries even exist anymore? Like, can you buy a BlackBerry? I'm not even sure. I don't think they exist anymore. Okay, so we can see what the different categories are, and we can see how they relate. So which one was the most common? Which one had the most? You can type your answer in if you want to. Okay, so the non-smartphones had the most. Okay, which one had the least? Right, the BlackBerries. Okay, and we can kind of see how they relate to each other. You can see that non-smartphones was actually twice as much, approximately, based on the kind of relative size of those bars, as iPhones, or twice as much as Androids. If you look really close, you can see that Android is slightly more than the iPhone. Okay, so this is the type of information that we can get from a bar chart. Now, in our class, we're going to be using a program called StatKey, and this is what the graph is going to look like inside of StatKey. And actually, let's just go ahead and go there, and so I can kind of show you what StatKey looks like. So the best way to get to StatKey is actually just by Googling StatKey. So StatKey, one word, Google it, and then the very first option that comes up is the one that you're going to want. There is links to StatKey inside of our Blackboard page and things like that, but I honestly, I just Google StatKey every time when I'm going there. It's the easiest way. Okay, so if you Google StatKey, then StatKey, that right here, this StatKey Lock 5 is the first thing that's going to come up. This is actually like an online statistical analysis tool that was made by the authors of your textbook. So it's going to do pretty much everything that we need to do this semester in our class. Beyond our class, it's not super powerful, but it's free, so that's a bonus, and you can get it from anywhere. So that's another bonus for our class. And it does a pretty decent job at doing the things that we need to do in our class, I think. So for all of chapter 2, we're going to be right over here on the left side where it says descriptive statistics and graphs. Okay, and as long as you know what you're dealing with, how many and what type of variables, then you can just click on that link. So in this case, we're looking at one categorical variable. So I can click on one categorical variable, and it will take me to the page that will let me do graphs and summary statistics for one categorical variable. All right, so one thing that's kind of nice is because this is done by the authors of your textbook, then some of the data sets from your textbook are already preloaded into StatKey. You don't even have to upload them in here, which is handy. It's not going to be that way for all the data sets, but for many of them it will be. And if it's preloaded, you can find it in this little drop-down box over here on the upper left-hand corner. So if you look in the upper left-hand corner and you click on where it says cell phone types, this data set came from your textbook. So now you can see what the graph looks like. All right, and if you roll your mouse over the button, then you can see that over on the side, it's got a frequency table going, and it kind of highlights the different bar that you're looking over there. So kind of handy dandy. So on your note paper, you're probably kind of making this list. So this would be like number 2 in that list. Number 1 was the bar chart. So this is number 2, which is a pie chart. Okay, in a pie chart, then the proportions of the pie correspond to the area sectors of the circle. So proportions for each category correspond to area sectors of the circle. Okay, and for my class, I hate pie charts. Like, I think they're totally worthless. So I think that pie charts are evil. You can put that in your notes. In my class, like, we're never gonna choose to do a pie chart, because anytime when you could do a pie chart, you could do a bar chart, and a bar chart is infinitely better, in my opinion, than pie charts. So most statisticians that I've talked to agree with me. They don't like pie charts either. But it seems like other people do tend to like pie charts. So you are going to see pie charts in real life, which is why I bring them up. And I'll show you what they look like. But then I'll tell you why I don't like pie charts and why bar charts are superior in every way. So look at that. Okay, so here's what a pie chart would look like. Like I said, the area of each slice of the pie corresponds to the overall proportion for each of the different categories. So we can tell by looking at this that non-smartphones was the biggest. We can tell that BlackBerry was the smallest. But just looking at this without seeing the data, can you tell whether Android or iPhone is bigger? You really can't, right? They look so similar to each other here, which is something that you're supposed to be able to tell by looking at the graph. I think it's reasonable to be able to want to look at that. So that's one reason why I don't like pie charts, because it's not really easy to compare the frequencies, and that's one of the main purposes for doing the chart in the first place. The other thing that I don't like about pie charts is that in Excel, you can start making fancy pie charts that are all 3D and they look really cool. And people like to do those because they do look cool. But as soon as you turn your pie chart 3D, you're actually distorting the data, because the slice of the pie that's closest to you is going to look bigger than the slice of the pie that is far away. So basically, whatever you want to say, like whatever you want to put emphasis on, put that slice of the pie in the front, because it's going to look bigger than it actually is. And it's going to give people a false impression of your data. So I don't like it when people lie with data. Okay, so here's some more evidence why pie charts are evil. Okay, so here's 3 different pie charts. Okay, looking at these pie charts, remember, we want to know what the categories are, and we want to know how the frequencies compare to each other. So in this case, we can see the different colors. So we're good on that part. But can we see how the frequencies relate to each other? Is it easy to look at these pie charts and be like, oh yeah, yellow is more than green, or, you know, red is obviously bigger than blue, or something like that? No, it really isn't, right? Like you look at those, you can kind of squint your eyes. If you think about it for a long time, maybe if you like get your finger out and try to measure, maybe you could figure it out. Okay, now let's look at bar charts of the same data. Okay, now I've got some bar charts of the same data. How easy is it to tell how the frequencies relate to each other? Can you immediately tell which one has the most, which one has the least, how they compare to each other? Yeah. Okay, so bar charts are like 1,000 bazillion times better than pie charts, in my opinion. So in our class, anytime I ask you for what a good graph to display the data would be, then don't say pie charts, because I don't think pie charts are good graphs. So essentially what that means is if you have one categorical variable, the best graph is going to be a bar chart. There's only one answer. So that makes it easy. If you're in the other professor's class, you might want to ask her feelings about pie charts. I don't know if she feels as passionately as I do about them, so I'm not sure what she's going to have you do. So just double check that before, but you can go ahead and share with her my pie charts or Evo feelings. So there is basically only one type of pie chart that I think is acceptable in our class, and that's if you have an actual pie. So if there's actual pie involved, go ahead, let's have a pie chart and save me some pie. Otherwise, then no pie charts in our class. Okay, so next let's talk about numerical summaries. Okay, so first step was to graph the data. The second step is to compute numerical summaries. So the numerical summary that we use for one categorical variable is called a proportion. So go ahead and write down the stuff that I'm going to show you on this slide. There's some symbols in here that were easier to just already have written up there instead of me trying to type it in, which is why I'm not typing it. But basically, we find a proportion. A proportion is a fraction that we've just turned into decimal form. So the fraction has the number in the category for the numerator and the total sample size for the denominator. When we're talking about proportions that are computed from sample data, then we call those p hat. That's the symbol for it. And when we're talking about a proportion from a population, then the symbol that we use is p. So make sure you write down this part too. So when we're talking about a sample proportion, the correct notation is going to be this p hat, so p with the little caret thing on top. And when we're talking about a proportion that's been calculated from population data, then we just call it p with no hat. All right, so here's for the Android cell phone. Okay, if I want to figure out the proportion of adult sample that do not own a cell phone, I would just take the number that do not own a cell phone, the 293, divided by the total sample size, which was 2253, and I get 0.13. Okay, so that's my proportion. If I write it in percent form, that would be 13%. Percents and proportions can sometimes be used interchangeably, but it's really important that you write them the correct way. So for example, if you just wrote 13 but did not include a percent sign, then your answer would be wrong, okay? Because if you're talking about a percentage, you have to have the percent sign. And then a proportion is going to be a number between 0 and 1, so you're going to have the 0.13. To change to a percent, you move the decimal 2 places and then add that percent sign. So like in general, proportions and percentages can be used interchangeably, but in practice, like in your homework and stuff like that, read the problem and say, does it ask what proportion of adults, or does it say what percent of adults, and then give the answer correspondingly, especially in Wiley Plus. You'll probably notice, probably wasn't too bad the first week, but Wiley Plus can be a little bit particular with how you enter in your answers. Like if it asks for an answer a specific way, if you don't enter that answer in that way, then it's going to mark it wrong, and you're going to be like beating your head against the wall because you'll be like, I know this, but it keeps marking it wrong, and then you can send me emails after that, and I'll tell you how to fix it. So we can do this for all of the different categories. When we make our chart with the proportions rather than the counts, then this is what we call that relative frequency table. So remember, this was another way we said we could organize our data, was as a relative frequency table. And looking at the relative frequencies is a good idea. Yeah, I think it's a little bit more easy to relate to than just looking at straight numbers. Sometimes when you're looking at the straight numbers, it's almost like you're trying to figure out these proportions anyway. So looking at this, we can see that 41% of people didn't have a smartphone back in 2012. Which seems like a pretty high number. I was probably one of those. Like I was a late adopter, not because I didn't want to, but just because I knew that like once I got one that I'd never go back. All right, so questions so far on how we find proportions and anything in our table, bar chart, all good stuff. Okay, one thing to note is that the relative frequencies, if you add all those up, they should add up to 1. If they added up to like 0.999, that doesn't mean you should panic. It just means that you probably had some round off error when you were computing the proportions. So 0.999 is all good. No panics. Okay, here's another example. This is some people that were given some different water to taste, and they were asked to choose their top choice. It was a blind taste test, so they didn't know which water they were tasting. And here was the results that they got. Okay, so 10 people said they preferred tap, 25 said Aquafina, 41 said Fiji tasted the best, 24 said Sam's Choice tasted the best. So if we wanted to figure out, hey, like what's the proportion of people who chose Aquafina, then I can just take 25 divided by the total number. And I can get the total number if they don't give it to me just by adding those numbers up. In this case, it was 100. So we can add all those numbers up, we get 100. And then we can figure out the relative frequencies or the proportions for each of those different groups. All right, and the notation, okay, did this data here about the water, did it come from a sample or did it come from the whole population? Okay, good, it came from a sample. Obviously it only has 100 people, right? The population is millions of people. So because it came from a sample, if I was gonna give a notation for this Aquafina 0.25, what's the notation that I should use? Remember we talked about the two notations, one was for samples and one was for populations. Yeah, good, p-hat. P-hat is the notation that we would use. Ooh, yeah, and if you even gave a subscript like of an A for Aquafina, that would be even a bonus, that'd be even better. All right, so just to kind of sum up one categorical variable, we organize the data into either a frequency table or a relative frequency table. The type of graph that we're going to use when we have one categorical variable is going to be a bar chart. Only one choice for this one because pie charts are evil. And the summary statistics that we're going to use are just proportions, just calculating proportions. All right, so now we are going to talk about what to do when you have two categorical variables. Because if one categorical variable was fun, then two categorical variables would be even funner. So this is like scenario number 2. We have two categorical variables. So first, let's talk about how the data is organized. And it's organized into something called a two-way table. In a two-way table, then one variable is represented in the rows and the other one is represented in the columns. All right, so I'm gonna show you an example of what that looks like. Okay, so this data that we're gonna look at here is data that was collected from university students where they gave their relationship status and their gender. So this is what a two-way table of that data looks like. So you can see that gender is represented by the columns here, male and female, and relationship status is represented by the rows. They had 3 options in a relationship. It's complicated or single. So that's what a two-way table looks like. In a two-way table, it doesn't matter which variable you put in the rows and which one you put in the columns. You can switch it up. It's just, it still means that the data is organized. It doesn't change the interpretation at all if you switch up which one's the row variable and which one's the column variable. Okay, so next, let's talk about graphs for two categorical variables. All right, so remember with one categorical variable, then the graph that we were going to use was a bar chart. And basically for two categorical variables, we're just going to do some variations on the bar chart. So anytime you're dealing with categorical variables, some kind of bar chart is the best answer for a graph. And the two types of bar charts for two categorical variables that we're going to talk about in our class are a side-by-side bar chart and a segmented bar chart. So here's that data that we were talking about with the relationship status and the gender. And here's an example of a side-by-side bar chart. So in this side-by-side bar chart, one of the categorical variables is represented along the x-axis, and the other categorical variable is represented by having 2 different bars within each of the other levels of the other categorical variable. So in this case, I've got relationship status down here, and then I've got a black bar and a gray bar that represent males and females in each one. And what we're looking for on these is we're trying to see if there's a relationship between the two variables. And there's going to be a relationship if things are different depending on the levels of the other variable. So how I look for that on a graph is here I've got these 2 bars, and I want to see kind of how the ratios of the 2 bars change or stay the same in each of the different categories. So for example, here's where it says in a relationship, you can see that the female bar is like 3 times the size of the male bar. So we've got kind of a 3-to-1 ratio here. Okay, it's complicated. Now the female bar is only about twice as tall as the male bar. So I've got about a 2-to-1 ratio here. So it's different. And then the single bar, I don't even have a 2-to-1. Now I've got like maybe 1.5-to-1 or something is the ratio here. So the ratio changed for all my different category levels. So that would indicate that there is a relationship between gender and relationship status. If it didn't matter, then we would see the same ratio for the bars for the different groupings, if that makes sense. This next one here, this one's a segmented bar chart. Okay, in a segmented bar chart, it's basically the same thing as the side-by-side bar chart, only instead of having 2 bars side by side, we just stack one of the bars on top of the other. So these are just stacked on top. And we're looking for the same thing. Again, kind of the ratio of the black to gray here. And you can still see the same thing. We've got about a 3-to-1 ratio here for the inner relationship, 2-to-1 or 2.5-to-1 here with the it's complicated, and not even quite a 2-to-1 ratio here with the single. Okay, again, indicating that there seems to be a relationship between those 2 variables. So somebody asked, why would you do a stacked rather than a side-by-side? I personally like the side-by-side ones the best. Stat key that we're using this semester, it only does the segmented ones like this one. But it's just kind of a matter of personal preference. They tell you the same thing. So whichever one you like better, you could do, assuming that you have the right software to do it. Excel can actually do bar charts pretty great in there too. So that's another place to do bar charts. So here's what those stacked or segmented bar charts would look like inside of StatKey. All right, and in StatKey, I'll flip over there real quick. If I go back to my main menu here where it says descriptive statistics and graphs, now I'm looking at 2 categorical variables. So you can see that if I click on 2 categorical variables, then you could get the graphs here. I don't know if this one is in here. I don't think this one is in here. So you can look at some of the other ones and see kind of the options you get there for those. That's how you would make it if you're. So next, let's talk about numerical summaries for these 2 categorical variables. Sometimes these are called descriptive statistics. Okay, they mean the same thing. For 2 categorical variables is what we're looking at here. Okay, so first of all, we're going to have marginal proportions. So we're still dealing with proportions because we're dealing with all categorical variables, but we have a few different types of proportions that we look at when we have 2 variables, because obviously it gets a little bit more complex the more variables that you have. Okay, a marginal proportion just looks at each variable by itself. Okay, and to compute a marginal proportion, we would take a row or a column total divided by sample size. Another type of proportion we're going to look at is something called a conditional proportion. Okay, a conditional proportion is really looking at the relationship between those 2 variables. And to calculate it, you're going to take a cell value divided by a row or column total. And really the key for both of these is reading the question and trying to figure out what it's asking and what should go in the numerator and what should go in the denominator. So we're going to watch for, when you're looking at the question, watch for the keyword of. Okay, so whatever follows the of is going to be the value that you're going to use. The total for that is what you're going to use for your denominator. Okay, so the question is going to be worded, or could be reworded to be something like this, like what percent of something are something. Okay, so this first of, whatever follows that, we're going to use the total for that as our denominator to create that proportion. And then whatever the combination of those 2 blanks is what we're going to use to create the numerator. And all this makes a little bit more sense when we're actually doing a problem. So let's look at some of those. Okay, so here's our first one. We want to know what proportion of students in this sample are in a relationship. Okay, so we have this keyword of. What follows the of is students in the sample. So students in the sample is everybody. So how many total students were in the sample? You can type it in the chat window. How many total students were in this sample? Yeah, good, 169. So that's my N, okay? So since that's what follows the of, that's going to be the denominator for my fraction that leads me to the proportion I'm looking for. So I want to know what proportion of students in this sample, so that's the 169, are in a relationship, okay? So if I use n, the total sample size is my denominator, then I'm going to use one of these other totals on the side or the bottom as my numerator. So in this case, I'm looking for in a relationship. So what is the total number of people in a relationship for this sample? Yeah, perfect, 42. So that means that the proportion that I'm looking for in this case is going to be 42 divided by 169, which is roughly 25%. All right, so let's try another one here. This one's a little bit trickier. Now I want to know what proportion of females in this sample are in a relationship. Oh, I said it was tricky, but not tricky enough for you guys. You guys are awesome. Okay, so this one, we want to know what proportion of females, okay? So whatever follows that of females, we're going to use that total. So the total number of females is 107. That's our denominator. And then I want to know of those, how many are in a relationship. So I'm looking at the combination of females and in a relationship, which is this cell right here. So I take the 32 over the 107. Okay, next one. What proportion of people in a relationship are female? Okay, good. So that one we're conditioning on people in a relationship. So I'm going to use the total for in a relationship as my denominator. And then I'm looking for the females in a relationship, which is 32 for my numerator. So notice that we have the same number for the numerator, but the question was worded differently each time. So we want to make sure that we always read the question really carefully. So the proportion of females in a relationship is not the same as the proportion of people in a relationship who are female, because the one way we got 30%, the other way we got 76%. So always read the question very, very carefully. Okay, here's one more for you to try. What proportion of males in this sample are in a relationship? Okay, good. So C. So we're looking of males, so I'm going to use the total for males, which is 62. In a relationship, so I'm going to use 10, so 10 over 62, which is 16%. Okay, so another thing that we look at, so we talked about numerical summaries, right, for two categorical variables. We said marginal proportions and conditional proportions, which are those numbers that we've been calculating. A third thing that you can add to that list is the difference in proportions. So we might calculate the difference, I think I have it, here we go, the difference in proportions. In this case, if we look at the proportion of females in a relationship and we want to compare that to the proportion of males in a relationship, then we just subtract. So difference in proportions is the third type of numerical summary that we use for two categorical variables. Okay, so to sum up two categorical variables, we organize that data in a two-way table. One thing I really want to mention here is that a two-way table is not a graph. So if I were to give you a scenario, like say I said, hey, suppose I'm interested in finding out if there's a relationship between gender and eye color, okay? What would be a good graph to display this data? Don't put two-way table, because two-way table is not a graph. It's just a way that we organize data. But I get that wrong answer a lot, which is why I'm bringing it up. So two-way table organizes the data. The graphs that we would want to choose would be a side-by-side bar chart or a segmented bar chart. Those can be used interchangeably, so it doesn't matter which one you put. And then the summary statistics that we use, marginal proportions, conditional proportions, and difference in proportions.